you ever had kids, or if you ever were a kid, you probably have experienced what I would call favorite song sickness. And favorite song sickness, it affects kids and adults differently. Kids who are suffering from favorite song sickness are sick until they hear their song again. It's their favorite song. They want to hear it again. They can't wait. If you were in my day, right, you had to wait usually on the radio and listen to the radio for them to play your favorite song, and it was amazing as they played it. And if you were good enough to get your tape and start recording it and pray hard enough, maybe that the DJs would not start talking over the beginning of your song, you might be able to get that thing recorded and listen to it more often. But you're sick until it comes on. 8 tracks. You guys remember 8 tracks? We had one 8-track in my, I've listened to one. It was Joy to the World. And I think that it stopped in the middle of the track. It was weird. Anyway, 8 tracks kind of alleviated some things. If you could get the tape, that was better. You know, if you got into cassette tapes. CDs made it worse because you didn't have to rewind a CD. You just hit back and it just, bam, you could play it. Or you could hit replay and just listen to it over and over again. MP3 players, that much worse. Now you can just stream it. I was listening, overheard. I wasn't trying to. It wasn't my fault that she was talking so loud. But there is this girl that was talking to another girl when I was subbing who said that she listened to one of, I couldn't tell because I don't listen to Taylor Swift, but she listened to one of Taylor Swift over 70 times in a row. If you think about that, that's if an average song is 3 minutes, 70 times, that's 210 minutes. That's a long time to listen to one song. The other person lamented that they had only listened to it over the weekend 40 times in a row. That's bizarre to me. You get sick until you hear it, and then you hear it, you feel better, but then you long for it again. You get sick, you got to start over again, right? For adults, it's a little bit different. While they're sick until they hear it, we are just simply sick of hearing it at all, right? And so we get trapped, especially with MP3 players now, we get trapped in these little dungeons called minivans. We have to listen to it over and over and over again, right? Sometimes things being repeated can be annoying. We kind of feel like Sisyphus. You guys remember Sisyphus? I know Quentin does. You remember Sisyphus? Does anybody know who Sisyphus was? Debbie? Who was Sisyphus? There you go, good job. He rolled the boulder up the hill, right? As soon as it got to the top, what happened? It went down and he had to roll it all over again, right? Over and over for the rest of his life. For all eternity, that's what he had to do. Sometimes it feels like that when we are listening to our kids' songs and over and over and over again. We feel like Sisyphus. There's a reason that we get annoyed and we call things broken records. When they start repeating themselves over and over and over and over. And getting annoyed yet? Get annoyed. This morning we're going to talk about Jesus and his healing on the Sabbath day. We've already talked about Jesus and his healing on the Sabbath day two other times. This is the third time that we're talking about Jesus healing on the Sabbath day. And it's not just that's the only time that we're talking about the healing, but there are other things that it would mention that he was doing on the Sabbath day that really annoyed the Pharisees or the religious leaders that were around him. So look at this and go, really? Again with the Sabbath? Incidentally, by the way, in case you didn't know, that question mark, exclamation point, did you know that it has its own name? It's its own punctuation. Did you know that? Just if you don't get anything else, hopefully you do. If you don't, when you put a question mark and an exclamation point together, it's called an interrobang. Now you know. It's called an interrobang. It's a real life thing. Okay? So that also helps you to know which one to put in front of the other, because it starts with the interrogative, starts with the question, and then it ends with a bang, the exclamation point. It's called interrobang. Okay, there you go. Okay, so put that aside. That is not what this is about, right? This is about going back into the gospel message about what Jesus is saying here to the Pharisees who are listening to him, because he has done something, again, that they objected to on the Sabbath. He's already healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day. They didn't like that. We saw just a couple of weeks ago that he healed a woman who was bent over for years of her life, and he healed her on the Sabbath day there in the synagogues. And now he's doing it again. But here's one of the main differences of this story that we're going to be reading today. This has very little to do with the healing. The healing is actually almost a side note. It's barely even mentioned. The main thrust of this text is Jesus' questions to the Pharisees. So as we go through this narrative of healing, I want us to begin to ask ourselves the same two types of questions that Jesus asks at the dinner table. They're similar questions that cause the Pharisees to be silent. And maybe we can answer them, maybe we can't. The two questions I want us to consider this morning are, the first one, what discourages us from acting? What discourages us from acting? The second one is the flip side of that coin. What encourages us to act? So what discourages us from acting and what encourages us to act? Because those are the two types of questions that Jesus ultimately is asking. So if you will, please stand for the honor of the reading of God's word. If you're using the Pew Bible, that's page 820. We're looking at chapter 14. We're just going to look at the first 6 verses of chapter 14. So one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, son or ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Thank you. You may be seated. So again, that first question that I want us to really be asking ourselves as we're going through this text, asking ourselves is, it comes right out of Jesus' questions to the Pharisees, to the rulers, or to the lawyers, and that is basically, what is it that is discouraging us from acting? Let's again look at the text. One Sabbath, verse 1, one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of the ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy, and Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Now, some of us are probably old enough to remember what it was like to have revival services in the church. You guys remember that? Some of us are not old enough because we've never experienced that. It's died out. When I was going to church, it was for 1 week, but those who were before me, they're used to maybe 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks, if possible, even maybe a month, where there was this revival speaker who would come in and he would preach every night. You guys remember that? And oftentimes what would happen is either right before the service or after the service, that revival preacher would actually be invited over to one of the members' house, maybe for dinner or maybe for some cake and coffee or something like that. You guys remember doing that as well? Having them over to your house? Okay? We don't generally do that anymore, but of course we don't really have revival services anymore either. But something probably like that is happening here. It is the Sabbath day, and if there was a guest speaker at synagogue, oftentimes somebody would invite that guest speaker over to their house after synagogue in order to eat with them and to have fellowship with them. And that's what probably is happening here. It's on the Sabbath day. Jesus is at the ruler of the Pharisees' house, in order to eat. Now, we don't know necessarily who this guy is. No name is mentioned. It says that he is a ruler of the Pharisees. We don't even exactly know what Luke meant by that. It could just simply mean that he was part of the Sanhedrin council, or it could simply mean that he was a ruler of the Pharisees. In other words, he had great influence over the Pharisees in that area, or probably, most likely, it means that he was both. He was a man of influence, but he was also part of the Sanhedrin council. Of course, if you're on the Sanhedrin council, you're probably going to have quite a bit of influence among your party. So Jesus goes to this man's house, and he goes there with a whole bunch of other Pharisees. And they're watching him like a hawk. They want to see, is he going to do something wrong? Is he going to mess up? Is he going to say something wrong? Is he going to do something wrong? And it's very possible that they even put a plant in there to see that he did do something wrong. We can't be sure because it doesn't explicitly state it. But it does read like maybe the man with dropsy was a plant. Again, Luke uses the word behold. He wants Theophilus to notice this guy, but he doesn't give really any explanation of what he's doing there or how he even got there. The woman at synagogue, she would be there. She would normally be at synagogue. That would be something that would normally happen on the Sabbath day. She would go to synagogue. There's a reason for her to be there. There is really no reason that we see that this man is even at the Pharisees' house. Typically, Pharisees would try to avoid people like this. So what is he actually even doing at the Pharisees' house in the first place? Very likely he was a plant there to see if Jesus would act with this man there in order to heal him on the Sabbath day as he has done so many times before. So it kind of reads that way. It also reads, not just because that guy just isn't, there's no explanation about where he comes from, but it also reads that when Jesus sees him, if you look at the text, it says, he responded, he replied. He didn't reply to the man. He didn't reply to the man with dropsy. And we see that nobody actually even has spoken a word yet. He sees the man there. Jesus turns from the man and actually starts speaking to the lawyers and the Pharisees, replying to them, even though they haven't said anything. He knows exactly why the man is there, and he is about to do exactly what the Pharisees were hoping that he was going to do. No one says anything. They're just watching. Jesus responds to them, and he asks them a question. Because their actions spoke louder than words. And he asks them, is it lawful? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Or is it not lawful? Literally, he asks, is it authorized? Is it authorized to heal on the Sabbath? Or is it not authorized? Luke loved to use the word authorize or authority. He uses it more than any other gospel writer. He uses it 21 times in his gospel account. He loved the idea of authority. And so here's Jesus, and he asks the Pharisees if it's lawful, if it is authorized to heal on the Sabbath. Authorized by what is the question? Because it's not the word lawful, so it's not like according to the law, is it okay? But simply, is it authorized to heal on the Sabbath? So the question is, authorized by what? Because if it's authorized, if he's asking, is it authorized by the law in order to heal on the Sabbath, then the answer is unequivocally, yes, it is. But if the question is it authorized by your interpretation of what the law says? In other words, man's tradition as to what the law means, well, then that is going to say, no, that's not authorized. And the idea is, what is discouraging them from acting? And what we see in verse 4 is that they were silent. They didn't say a word. It wasn't that they had no response, but that they chose not to respond. It wasn't that they couldn't answer him. It was that they wouldn't answer him. And in this moment, to them, it wasn't about them. Jesus is trying to make it about them. It's not about us. Not even really about the man with dropsy. It's about Jesus. Jesus, again, turns it around because it's not about him. It's really not about the man with dropsy. It was about them. What's in their hearts? What's in their minds? To them, Jesus was the one who was being scrutinized, not them. Jesus turns the tables on them. And so what Jesus does is he actually gives the answer that they wouldn't give him. Look at verse 4. But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him on his way. Remember, the one thing that Luke wanted Theophilus and all of his readers to understand was that Jesus had authority. If you do a word search on your phone or your tablet, whatever it is, and you do a word search for authority, what you will see is over and over and over again, Luke begins to use it with Jesus. Because Jesus, more than anyone, knew that he was authorized to do whatever he needed to do. He was the one with authority. He knew what was authorized more than anyone else would. So the fact that he actually heals this man on the Sabbath day goes to show and is the answer to his question, is it authorized or is it not authorized? The fact that he did it means that he had the authority and it was certainly authorized to do. He proved it was lawful. Again, remember that just because we see that there is a healing doesn't mean that the healing is actually the main event of the story. Well, we see this healing takes place in 11 words in the English, 6 words in the Greek. And then it's done. The question was, what was discouraging the Pharisees, the lawyers, from acting? Why wouldn't they do this? I mean, certainly they didn't have the opportunity, they didn't have the ability to heal like Jesus would heal. But they begrudged him for doing it. They said it wasn't right, it wasn't proper in their own minds, in their own traditions, in their own hearts. It was not proper for him to do it. Why would they begrudge this? What was keeping them from seeking to do mercy ministry in their own lives on the Sabbath day? What was it that was going on? You see, it's so often depicted that the Pharisees were very hard-hearted jerks that didn't like to do anything. They enjoyed seeing people in their misery, and they would do nothing to alleviate that. That really wasn't them. It was actually much more deep than that. It wasn't that they were just simply hard-hearted. They certainly had a pride problem, but they probably had a pride problem for very good reason. The people elevated them. They held them to high standards. They held themselves to high standards of holiness. The people in turn also held them to high standards. They knew who the Pharisees were. They knew what they were supposed to do. They knew what they weren't supposed to do. They watched the Pharisees. This is what a holy man is supposed to be. Sometimes it was annoying. Nobody likes to see a holy man. Makes us feel very small. And certainly they would have a pride problem. They were haughty. Wasn't great, wasn't appealing. But they held themselves to high standards of purity. The crowds held them to high standards of purity. So outward holiness was everything. If they were caught doing something that was considered to be unholy, their reputation for being a pure man would be ruined. Think about it this way. Pharisees. Think about it like the Pharisees were the celebrity pastors of their day. Yeah. If the Pharisees were alive today, they'd be on X and they'd be on Facebook and they'd be doing their Instagram reels and all that stuff, right? And people would be watching them, people would be looking at them and anything that they do, right? I mean, we've seen it before. We've seen people mess up. We've seen celebrity pastors. They haven't gotten into huge scandals or anything like that. No, we're not talking about moral failure. We're just talking about things that they shouldn't have said, or maybe they worded wrongly or something like that, and then it just everything broke loose, right? We've seen it before. Got to be really careful when you're with your public persona. These are the guys that the pastors wanted to sound like. These are the guys that the seminary students want to be like. And since nobody really can know the heart of the people, of these celebrity pastors, nobody could really know the hearts of the Pharisees, all they could see was their outward works, their outward holiness. So if that got ruined, if that reputation got ruined, they were done for. They had to weigh their options carefully, lest word got around that they did something or said something that was unlawful, something that was unauthorized. And to heal on the Sabbath day, well, that would be considered work. And if they did that, then they would be considered of doing something that was unauthorized, something unlawful by healing on the Sabbath day. They couldn't do that. But neither could they support the ones who did, because they'd be thrown into that camp as well. Oh. So you're a fan of the sinners who work on the Sabbath day. So I have to not just be silent. I have to come out against that person. Happens quite often in ministry with regular pastors, not celebrity pastors, regular pastors. They have to be really careful, right? They may just only be known by their congregation and maybe some people in the community. Pastor sees, hears something, it's been unjust, some type of injustice done towards somebody. What do? I mean, injustice goes against God's word, right? We are to be a people who do justly. We're supposed to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. But what will people think if we do? What if we stand up and say, that was unjust, that was wrong? Should he say something? Should he not say something? If he says something, some people might go out there and go, whoa, that pastor just got woke. Because he's standing up for injustice. Or he's not standing up, he's standing against injustice from the pulpit. Does he support the guy who does? Because maybe he just doesn't feel like he can, right? And so he's scared, and so he doesn't say anything about the injustice that is being done. But he also can't stand up and say anything good about the person who does, the pastor who does speak against the injustice. Because again, he gets thrown into that woke class. He doesn't want to be seen as woke. So he just says nothing. And maybe even if pressure is big enough, he might even speak against it, might tweet against it. Even though speaking against injustice is not just okay, it is lawful, it is authorized. We have been given the authority to actually do that. But a pastor feels like he has to weigh his options very carefully, or his reputation might be ruined. Be the same thing with women, right? And I don't mean, I'm talking about pastors with women. Got to be really careful. Don't be seen with a woman in public. Don't be seen with a woman, obviously. Can't meet with them in private. Because what will people think? Reputations can get ruined. They certainly can. Many Christians will refuse to go into dark places. I don't mean literally dark. I mean figuratively dark. Metaphorically dark. Not because they're callous-hearted people who wish that people will perish in their sins. Generally, they refuse to go there because, well, we have a reputation to maintain. What are the others going to think about me? What will they say about me? Will I lose my Christian witness? Paul says to the Ephesians, he says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. There are a lot of works of darkness. And we are not called, and in fact, this text, right? We are called actually not to participate in those works. They are unfruitful, and they are shameful. But as Darrell Bock says, this is not a prohibition of having relationships with unbelievers, but only of sharing in their deeds. The call of the Great Commission assumes engagement with those outside the faith. So we can certainly agree that we are not supposed to go out there and we are not supposed to commit adultery and we're not supposed to go and get drunk and we're not supposed to go and get high and we're not supposed to go out there and steal. Those are all works of darkness. Those are all things that are worthless. They're unfruitful. They're shameful. We don't do those things. But we are. We are supposed to come beside the adulterer and the drunkard and the stoner, the thief. and speak the truth in love and expose their deeds, that they might hear the light of the gospel and be children of light. And people won't understand. They're going to be upset. And they're going to label you as something that you aren't, just like they did Jesus. This friend of sinners, this drunkard and this glutton. And it's not just individual Christians that have this problem. Churches as a whole, churches as a body have this same problem. I am so convinced that churches have exchanged the power of God for parlor tricks of man. It's easier to bring in a Christian magician than go out and do Christian ministry. Rather than go out and actually do the hard work of the kingdom, we want to attract people into our doors and to the kingdom. I know I'm that way. That's my natural default. But it's the kingdom ministry that actually attracts people to the kingdom message. It's the kingdom ministry, it's the kingdom work that actually confirms the kingdom word. Going out there and getting involved out there. They will know that we are Jesus' disciples by our, what's the word? Love. They will praise our Father because of our light. And they will listen to our message because of our ministry. But that means getting out into the communities, both as individuals and as a church body, and showing the power of God. And giving the proclamation, then, of God as well. And so the question really is, what is discouraging us from acting? Because oftentimes, it's our reputation. Authorization, lawfulness for us is more about the acceptance of our peers than actually thinking through the law itself. And then there's a second question. Jesus asks a second question. It's the flip side of the coin, like I said. So the first question is, what is discouraging us from acting? And the other question is, then, what encourages us to act? So let's look at verse 5. And he said to them, which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. So again, here he is. He's asking a question. It's not really an I gotcha question, though it does certainly get them because they can't answer. Again, it said they couldn't answer. If they answered, bad things would happen. Jesus wins that argument if they answer. They're really stuck between a rock and a hard place there, so they just give no answer. They just can't. It's not an I gotcha question, but it is certainly a revealing question. What actually gets the Pharisees, what actually gets the lawyers to act on the Sabbath day? And part of that could be, I think there is something to it, that they would act simply because somebody fell or something fell down a well. As if an ox is more important than the person. We saw that with the woman who was bent over. Would they go and take their ox or their donkey and lead them to water so that they could drink on the day? Yes, they were authorized to do that. They could do that. So there's something, but you see that they're more important than this woman who has been suffering for these past 18 years. That's maybe part of it, but really the fact that Jesus actually adds the son in here, it's not so much that they're more important as it is that there's an urgency there. You fall down a well, someone you know falls down a well, that's urgent. Anybody remember, I am dating myself over and over again. Anybody remember baby Jessica? You guys don't remember baby Jessica? Some of you do? Okay, baby Jessica. 18 months old, fell into a well. Nobody cared what day it was that baby Jessica fell into that well. All they really wanted was to rescue baby Jessica. The entire world watched as baby Jessica was being rescued out of that well, and they dug down deep into it, right, to get her out. And everybody was just all up in arms, or praising, that, oh, we finally did it, when we finally did it. I don't remember how long it took them. I remember watching it on Good Morning America. I was 7 years old. I remember watching that on Good Morning America, right? If you really want to feel old, baby Jessica is now 37 years old. Had to look it up. Nobody cared that baby Jessica fell down there on a certain day. It's just that she needed to get rescued. There is an urgency there. There is an immediacy there. That's why Jesus even uses the word immediately. You will immediately pull them out. You don't even necessarily think about it. You pull them out. That's what Jesus says to the Pharisees. You will just immediately do it because it is an urgent thing without even thinking about it. You will do it. That is their character. That is within the nature. The nature of the believer, the nature of Christ was to see the suffering and heal the suffering. If we are to be like Christ, we see the suffering, our nature ought to be, at some point in time, in our sanctification, the desire to work on that suffering, to heal that suffering. We don't have to wait for it to be an urgency. We see it as already important. Most people alive wait until there is an urgent need before they act. Wait for that hurricane to hit. Wait for the blizzard to come in. Wait until a war breaks out. All of a sudden there's urgency. All of a sudden there's just a movement, an action that's being taken place. We wait until there are homeless people all over the place during the summer, but we really don't do anything about it until ultimately that temperature gets to be outside, and then all of a sudden places begin to open up their doors for the night. It's the urgent that brings the action. Urgent things matter. We're not supposed to ignore the urgent. I'm not asking anybody to ignore the urgent. The urgent opens up our eyes to situations that we may not have actually even seen before. We didn't even know necessarily it existed. But at the same time, often things become urgent because they were ignored while they were important. In this narrative, Jesus shows that there are some important matters that could be taken care of at any time if we'd be willing to act. This man had dropsy. We don't use that word dropsy. It's not really diagnosed very much anymore. I'll give you another word for dropsy. If you don't know what dropsy is, maybe you know what edema is. It's retention of water or retention of fluid in the cells and the tissues. And that's what this guy had. Most likely, it was not going to kill the man that Sabbath day. And yet Jesus healed him anyway. Again, the woman bent over for 18 years. What's one more day? That's what the Pharisees were asking at that point. You could have come 6 days out of the week. Why do it on the Sabbath day? Because the need was seen on the Sabbath day. It wasn't urgent, but it's still important. Jesus says you can act on the important anytime. And we're called to act on the important anytime. There are plenty of important issues that are surrounding the church today. And doctrine is just one of them. And we are ignoring these important issues as individuals and as a church. We bemoan them maybe, but we're doing really nothing about them. There are moral issues. We hear about it all the time. We probably are talking about it all the time. We're just not really doing anything, right? But the LGBTQ, and we like to talk about the agenda, and we bemoan it and say all types of things about it, but what are we doing? It's beyond important. Now it's urgent. And we act as if it's not our job. There are other things that are not yet urgent, but they're really important. They're coming up to urgency very quickly. Do you know that there are around 400,000 foster care children in the U.S. alone? 400,000 foster care children, and not nearly enough foster care homes. 114,000 kids are waiting to be adopted. 114,000 kids waiting to be adopted. Do you know that one of the first distinguishing, what attracted people to the church in the first century was their care for the widows and the orphans? It's not that way anymore. There are certainly other important matters: marriage and divorce, abuse, poverty. So many other things that could use our attention. Areas that we could actually bring the gospel in and lead people into the kingdom through discipleship. In 1973, a landmark case came from the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade. Anybody ever heard of Roe v. Wade before? We fought 50 years. As evangelicals, we fought alongside with Roman Catholics and others as well, fought 50 years to get Roe v. Wade overturned. Before then, before 1973, it wasn't even a blip on the evangelical radar. Roman Catholics were doing everything they could to stave off abortion, to kill human life. Evangelicals ignored it because it wasn't urgent and it wasn't really even important to them at that point in time. We are familiar that I think it was 1978, that the Southern Baptist Convention actually endorsed abortion. You guys remember that? We had to repeal that in the 80s. We didn't think it was a big deal until it finally became urgent, and then we're like, oh, we should probably start doing something about this. Why do we wait until it's urgent? Why is it not in our nature to do that which is what we see as important? Why don't we do it? Why is it not that we're I don't want to use that word. Why are we not living Christ in this world? Same thing happened in 2015 with Obergefell versus Hodges. Something that evangelicals just weren't really, we were like kind of up in arms about it, talking about it, but we did really very little to do anything about it. And then suddenly in 2015, homosexual marriage is a thing, and now we're like, oh no! Maybe we should have cared a little bit more. Not wait for the urgent. Rather than caring and showing that we care. And by that I mean not being mad about it. Not being angry about it, but actually caring for the people. Rather than that. When these matters were important, we waited until they were urgent. And then rather than act, we actually ended up reacting. We became much more reactionary. And that's not a good thing. So I heard a quote not too long ago. It's easy to act like a Christian. It's much harder to react like a Christian. We can't just react toward the urgent. We actually need to act in the important. So as we finish this text this morning, we have two questions that we have to deal with. In Jesus' day, it was about the Sabbath day. And it's kind of like a broken record, on the Sabbath day, on the Sabbath day, on the Sabbath day. And yet we need this repetition. Because who among us actually learns the first time that we hear it? We keep seeing these things happening on the Sabbath because we need to be told over and over again that we are called to do good any and every time that we can. We are called to take initiative, to do good. We're not supposed to wait at risk of death before we take initiative, like the Pharisees. Hey, if your son falls into a well, you immediately go because there is risk of death. We shouldn't have to wait till the risk of death. We certainly shouldn't have to wait until we believe that our nation is dying before we take action. We take action when we see that there is a need and we see that it is already important. That's part of the gospel living. It's part of the gospel witness. We're generally not going to be the ones who are going to be able to perform signs and wonders like the apostles did. Not in that way with miracles. We're probably I'm gonna if I was a betting man, I would bet that nobody here has performed a miracle. I might lose that bet, but I probably wouldn't. We're not the ones who are going to be doing the miracles that then open up the opportunity for the gospel, wonders, attracting people, so then the gospel message can be given, signs that show that the message that was just given was true. We're not going to be the ones that are doing that. But our gospel ministry can serve the same purpose. Our ordinary tasks can still attract people to Jesus. And so as we leave this morning, we need to ask ourselves, what's discouraging us? What's keeping us from acting? And then ask ourselves, what is it that is actually encouraging us to act? What's propelling us to act? And then lastly, we really ought to ask, is this the way that Christ saw his actions? If it's not, then we are the ones that need to change. We need to start aligning our actions and our motives with his. Let's pray.